Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Stephen. Welcome to this edition of Blogging Heads. Today we are going to be covering, I think, some pretty fun territory, including the madness of conservative women and what it's like to be part of the Kochtapus. So let's get started. I'm Katherine Mangu-Ward. I'm a senior editor at Reason Magazine, and
I am Stephen Spruiell. I'm a staff writer for National Review and National Review Online.
Nice to be chatting with you, Stephen.
Nice to be chatting with you, Catherine. So, insane conservative women.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Let's just kick it off. We'll get right into it there. We've now, to say it that way, it's certainly pretty incendiary, because I think that when you talk about the women that people might be tempted to lump into this category. You have Christine O'Donnell, who just won her primary in Delaware. You have Sharon Angle in Nevada. You have, who are some of the others that we were going to talk about?
Well, everybody's favorite, Sarah Palin.
Of course.
And I think it's really fair to put Michelle Bachmann in there as well, who has now been serving in Congress for a while, so she's old news, but always reliable for a nice viral video clip.
That's right. And particularly when she's auto-tuned.
And she is lovely on the auto-tune the news, which
good.
we'll provide the link for off in the sidebar here.
Yeah.
So basically, I guess my interest in this topic is just to raise it almost as a sociological question. I mean, it is not merely a figure of speech when I say that some of my best friends are conservative women. I have been known to be lumped as a libertarian woman into that category occasionally, and yet I think there's some kind of undeniable weirdness going on in the American political scene right now, that we have really the most prominent conservative women in elected office are certainly portrayed as, and I think somewhat fairly portrayed as, a bit batty. So what's going on there? Is it just a reporting bias? Is it that these women are no particularly battier than either other women or other elected officials? So you can take your pick. And just that we're talking about media bias, and that when they say crazy things, it's more likely to get picked up. Or is there something about our political culture or political system that elevates a certain kind of conservative or a certain kind of conservative woman into the public eye more rapidly or more prominently?
Well, I'm willing to entertain any one of those theories, and I would also be careful to draw distinctions, because whereas I think whatever you may think of Sarah Palin, she's not crazy. I think that when it comes to someone like Sharon Angle, I think crazy might be too strong a word, but certainly her views are very extreme. I mean, part of it is that this primary season has seen the elevation of some politicians with unconventional views, because I don't think that the Republicans really saw this coming at all. And so, the time that they might have put into recruiting candidates more carefully, I don't think that got done because, I don't know that they knew how strong this wave was going to be. So it's not just women like O'Donnell and Angle, but also you have Rand Paul, who's a very has a lot of unconventional views. Beating somebody like Trey Grayson, who's a very conservative Republican in Kentucky, but much more of a conventional politician and a stronger candidate in any other year, but not this year.
I actually think it's worth noting, or sort of emphasizing the point that you just made about the distinction between what the Republican Party kind of would have done or might have done or expected to do this election season and what actually happened. I think some people are using the rise of these Tea Party or Tea Party-esque candidates as further evidence that the Republican Party is insane. And while the Republican Party might be insane, they are these are not their candidates. These are
Right.
these are not the people who the Republican Party would have chosen. These are people outside of the normal selection process and outside of the body of the party. The very fact that that these people sort of show up on the scene as a surprise, I think, is evidence that, if anything, the Republican Party is quite mainstream and deserves to be thought of as the party of the American center-right, just as the Democrats are the party of the American center-left.
Sure. Now, I mean, I'd be interested to get your take on this question, which is that, as you said, there are plenty of male Republicans who have been known to say very fringy type things, but for some reason the women who do seem to have a higher profile and seem to be just more divisive. I mean, I can post a link on the corner about Sarah Palin and be completely neutral about it. I mean, just basically like linking to the story, like, here's an interesting story about Palin. And the emails from both her supporters and detractors start immediately pouring in, right? I mean, it's just a Rorschach test. And I'm wondering, does this is something about this because she's a woman? Do men who defend her, are they acting on some kind of like, we must rise to protect our honor kind of instinct, and whereas women who dislike her feel like she's gotten everything that she has because of the feminist movement, and then she goes on Twitter and calls them a cackle of rads, which is
right.
I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I don't think that she meant it in a nice way. So what is your take on how divisive they seem to be, and is that because they're women?
I have to say, Sarah Palin and some of these other women have been great for my career from this perspective.
Right.
There is this seemingly insatiable demand for thumbsucker pieces on what it means that these women are sort of provoking the ire and admiration of the American public. And, I don't have a particularly great answer to that question, but it doesn't stop people from paying me to write little essays attempting to answer it. And my best guess is something similar to what you just said, that there is, there's this, it feels new. It feels like a new phenomenon in the American political scene to see a woman who wants to use the word feminist. Sarah Palin wants to call herself a feminist, for instance, and I think that's true of many of these other women too. But the professional keepers of the word feminist mean something else by it. They don't mean what she means. They don't.
Yeah.
They don't mean strong woman in running sneakers who is also pro-life. They mean a very particular set of political views that have to do with abortion and sexual harassment laws and gender discrimination and pay inequality, and that the word feminism really has come to mean, at least in its political context, something narrower that doesn't include these women, and to have them show up on the scene and sort of claim that word and claim the mantle of successful, powerful womanhood or something is unsettling. At the same time, I think it's telling that the sort of, the Mama Grizzly stuff and all that a lot of the support for these women is from women. It's not just some kind of weird, sexy authority figure or men springing to the defense of the innocent or woman in need of protection. It's something else. And maybe it's just a shift in conservatism that, conservatives are increasingly uninterested in kind of nitty gritty, wonky, fiscal discipline type stuff, although they remain fond of using that rhetoric. And that the focus is really more about culture and the personal, and that women are perceived as good spokesmen for that side of conservatism or republicanism.
Right, and that those are kind of the most divisive issues. It's almost like considered old-fashioned to have some of the views, and particularly like jarring in a way when Sarah Palin is making a bunch of cultural points about trying to kind of redefine feminism, and yet she's out there. She has this career that have led a lot of. I mean, I know several conservative women who just dislike her intensely because they think that she's a bad mother. I mean, it's almost like they share some of her views about female gender roles and the kind of proper place of a woman, and they
Right.
do not they think that she is a bad mother because of the fact that she's going around and seemingly like putting her career ahead of her family in so many ways. Now I'm not making that judgment. I don't know what kind of mother Sarah Palin is. I have never met her, but I mean I feel like it's almost she is a whatever is kind of your hang up, you can read that into her behavior, and also because these cultural topics tend to be much more divisive, and positions that are opposed to yours seem a lot more radical than, for instance, when we're debating like the individual mandate in healthcare, or what the top marginal tax rate should be. I mean, it's like those differences. Seriously, we're having a huge debate right now over whether the top marginal tax rate should be 35% or 39.4%. Or 0.6% or whatever. And, that's like, it's really hard to get worked up and say, you're crazy if you think that the top rate should be 39.6%. That's nuts. But like, if Sharon Angle is going out and talking about, tyrannical government and the need for Second Amendment remedies. I mean, saying things like that, or I can't remember, maybe it was a radio show host who said that and then she agreed with it. But whatever the case may be, she said some very odd things. She's not the best candidate on the stump, and she, tends to kind of go off message quite a bit, and start talking about how God wants her to be the next senator of Nevada, and that's the kind of thing that is going to be very divisive and considered crazy by especially by urban liberals, and especially urban liberals in the media. They're going to be like, this person is nuts. Whereas on the economic topics, which is not doesn't typically tend to be what a lot of these women that we're talking about spend a lot of time on. It's not quite as the differences aren't quite as great.
And yet, I think it's interesting that, and this actually transitions us into another topic I think we want to cover. It's interesting that the Tea Parties are still perceived as, and I think really are, spurred by these economic issues, among other things. Mm-hmm. That it's true that the difference in the actual tax proposals on the table is incredibly small, but I think the more kind of basic issue that people are reacting to, the kind of gut issue of, are we going to freak out about the debt and deficit, or are we not?
Right.
That is something that really does animate people in a way that can feel just as polarizing as social issues.
Sure, and not to interrupt you, but just to make
Sure.
this really quick point, it was clear that Christine O'Donnell had not really put that much thought into these debt and deficit issues. I mean, she started out and made her reputation as somebody who campaigned on social issues and social issues alone, and yet it was clear she came into our office and was repeatedly talking about how how she had come around to the view that you couldn't be a social conservative without also being a conservative on fiscal matters, and
Right.
she's been making an effort to rebrand herself as a fiscal conservative first, because that's what the Tea Party really wants to hear, and particularly in Delaware, where the social conservative stuff doesn't play as well. She's been trying to kind of redirect her focus onto those issues.
And yet at the same time, we have people who have come into the game with a focus on the fiscal issues, who by and large haven't really taken off with the Tea Party folks. I'm thinking here of not only your basic, Paul Ryan's, who, was already in office and will be reelected, but hasn't become the face of the Tea Party,
Mm-hmm.
or even, older familiar characters like Gingrich, and also, people who are kind of newish on the national scene, like Gary Johnson, the former governor of New Mexico, who's been feeling around about a presidential run, and who is a pretty serious fiscal conservative, but hasn't been taken up by the Tea Party folks. And I wonder if one reason that's true might be found in this meme that's sort of going around, and actually President Obama in a speech yesterday brought this up. Okay, Tea Party people, you're freaked out about the size of government, you're freaked out about debt and deficit. What would you cut?
Right.
Tell us what you would cut. And I'm going to take a moment here to plug Reason Magazine has an upcoming issue that's going to be all about what people would cut. And the reason this issue is a little bit exciting is because it's a 3D issue.
I saw that.
Yeah. And I'm going to sport right now, even though you can't see them, Stephen, the patented Reason 3D glasses, which I'm wearing at the moment.
They come with the issue, like as an insert?
Yep, they're going to come with the issue. They have a little Reason R on them. They're very swank. They say free minds and free markets on them. And the idea is to do this kind of as a Halloween special. So it's a slasher issue. How do you slash government?
Nice. Clever.
Yeah, it's hokey, but it's kind of good. And so what we're trying to do here is basically give an answer to this question: what would you cut? And I think it's a tough answer to give when you see these polls that say the only thing that Tea Party people want to cut is foreign aid,
right?
Which is a tiny section of the budget. Obviously, there's a disconnect going on. So I guess maybe Stephen, you could tell us, what would you cut?
Well, this is a problem, right? Because obviously, like you said, foreign aid, cutting foreign aid isn't gonna cut it, and neither are a lot of the things that I feel like we could do away with right now without really having much of an impact other than a positive one. Like farm subsidies is a clear example of something that you could quickly phase out, even parts of that program. Just the direct payments alone, phasing that out would have paid for any one of the Democrats' jobs bills, the mini jobs bills, probably not the stimulus. But, the point is that non-defense discretionary spending is not where the real money is. And my colleague, Kevin Williamson, who writes our a blog on debt and deficits, asks every one of these candidates who comes in, are defense and entitlements on the table for you in terms of getting the debt and deficit under control? And this was one of the problems. Sharon Angle really, didn't have very well-developed views on entitlement reform. The young guns who were in here the other day, Eric Cantor, Kevin McCarthy, Paul Ryan. Of course, naturally, Paul Ryan is going to be able to speak fluently on the issue of entitlement reform. But, I mean, it's going to be very difficult. I'd be interested to know, what does, in your issue, what did you guys find on the subject of entitlement reform? Because obviously we could talk about, it'd be great. I'd love to, you and I sit here and talk about ridiculous boondoggle earmarks and, stupid, redundant, non-defense discretionary programs that we could just cut wholesale outright, but that's not going to solve the problem, and neither is raising taxes on the rich. That seems to be the only kind of, raising the top tax rate seems to be the only kind of tax increase that the Democrats are willing to entertain without the cover of some deficit commission, and that's a very paltry sum compared to what we owe. And so, what did you guys find on the subject of entitlement reform and the Tea Party, and how would you approach that topic?
Yeah, so one thing you're absolutely right about is that to a very, very large extent, earmarks are a red herring. As much as I find your various turtle crossing funding and bridge to nowhere and these kind of things. Those are great recruitment tools, I think, for libertarians and small government types. That's the kind of thing that people get mad at. But it is amazingly consistently true that if you tell someone, you're going to have an extra 1 cent tax on your Coca-Cola, they will freak out. And at the same time, they will cheerfully watch a third of their paycheck disappear month after month and not really even question where that money is going.
Yeah.
So one thing that we suggested outright in our pages, in a piece by Brian Doherty, one of our senior editors here, is to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, even if we end them, ahead of Obama's current, fairly ambitious schedule. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars right there. Although, as a sort of side note, it's worth pointing out that there was a recent study that came out that the peak of the costs of American, 20th century American wars comes years and years after the end of any kind of action in the theater. It's because of the cost of veterans benefits, mostly, and also lost productivity for people who've been wounded or otherwise put out of commission. So, even ending the war today doesn't end the cost of the war, and that's always worth keeping in mind. For entitlements, it's a really tough issue, and the fact is that most of our pieces on that subject wind up saying something like, it would be nice to dramatically cut back benefits in all the ways that everyone knows we could do, but politically it's really not clear how that's going to happen. Of course, the totem of this is the Tea Party sign that says, I hate socialized medicine, don't touch my
Keep your government hands off my Medicare.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's telling, that it's essentially, it's going to have to be some kind of incredibly unpopular and election-losing move to cut these entitlements, and I'm not sure exactly how that's going to happen. Other things that we covered in the issue are, and I think this is something that's it's not sexy, and so it doesn't get a lot of coverage, but government guarantees. The Fannie and Freddie problem is the most prominent of this, but the U.S. government guarantees all kinds of risky behaviors in the private market right now.
Yeah.
And so people indulge in those risky behaviors, and then occasionally, as happened recently, government turns out to actually be on the hook for these guarantees. Both in the form of bailouts and also just continued infusions of taxpayer money into ongoing efforts. So, I think pension reform on the state level is huge also, and that's something that might be doable. California is, of course, the case study here. They're totally out of money and totally powerless in the face of unions. So that's going to require something at the ballot box. That's going to require referenda or fighting referenda. But I think it may be that, once again, we're going to have to look to the states as our everybody's favorite cliche, laboratories of democracy, to see how cuts really happen, if they happen. And the best way to spur that, of course, would be to stop sending huge chunks of money from the federal government that doesn't have it to the states in the form of jobs bills, education jobs bills, stimulus money, second stimulus money, third stimulus money. So I think that would be a good place to start, is, at least don't bail out the states anymore, and let's see what they do and see if any of them have lessons for the federal level. Right.
I think that's true, and I think that is probably, one of the only things that we can say for sure that we would get from a Republican majority in the House or in either chamber, even even cutting into the Democrats' majority in the Senate would give Republicans substantial ability to at least stop the new spending, stop the new stimulus spending that's going out the door. But in terms of actually cutting spending, that's going to be really difficult. I know that, liberals and Democrats, cannot wait to be on comfortable territory again, defending Sesame Street and kids' school lunches from, these mean conservatives who want to cut those programs. And so, I'm slightly worried about some of the dangers here of, the kind of thing that happened in 1995 when you had a lot of very, ideologically mission-driven candidates swept into office who decided to, shut down the government over, very small percentage of discretionary spending. I mean, I think Boehner is smarter than that. I think, the guys who are in there now, a lot of them came in '94 and have learned those lessons. But, the question is, how do you cut spending without getting into a showdown over a president who I think is more ideologically liberal than Clinton, who I think will be slower to pivot to the center, in the face of a Republican majority who's determined to cut spending. I think, we've already seen what his answer to the problem of deficits is going to be, and it's going to be higher taxes. The one area where I think you might see some kind of productive compromise. It gets to something that you were talking about, which is on Fannie and Freddie, the problem of what to do with those GSEs that are hemorrhaging money, because that's where administration officials, Tim Geithner, who knows if he'll still be there after the election. Obama hinted yesterday that he might be changing his economic team, but even people like Barney Frank have said, like, the GSEs need to be abolished. That business model did not work, and they're continuing to lose billions of dollars a quarter. We have to do something about this. I think the Republicans are feel equally comfortable with some of their legislative solutions for sunsetting Fannie and Freddie, for winding them down, putting them into some kind of receivership. The question becomes what replaces them. And unfortunately, when you talk about, like you said, the issue of guarantees, of our government just becoming a giant bank, that's one where unfortunately the momentum seems to be moving in the opposite direction. Simultaneously, as we've realized that Fannie and Freddie were, that business model was terrible of private profits and socialized risk. You've seen proposals for a $50 billion infrastructure bank, and they just passed a bill that would create a $30 billion lending fund for community banks. So it's completely schizophrenic. It's like, we realize that Fannie and Freddie failed and were terrible ideas, so let's create a bunch of little Fannie and Freddies in transportation and community banking, and it makes no sense. So I think that hopefully when Republicans come into office, they won't be as schizophrenic as the administration on that. They'll say, we need to sunset Fannie and Freddie, and instead of creating this infrastructure bank, let's come up with a smarter formula for allocating transportation money than just, South Dakota gets as much money as New York, or that it's allocated based on how many miles of highway that you have, or, something stupid like that.
Right. Well, and actually another short essay we have in our issue is by Bob Poole, who's a transportation expert at the Reason Foundation, which is the nonprofit that publishes Reason, who just makes the very simple proposal: let's only spend highway funds on highways. Yeah. That just that kind of thing, I think, is very plausible. The other element of the cover package is the element of hope. We have 3 stories of how it can be done, and I actually think that's incredibly important to keep in mind. I mean, you and I, people who clearly are concerned about these issues, who are pretty informed about them, who want to do something. I know I frequently kind of give in to despair, and I think it's worth noting that it's happened under some pretty amazing circumstances, including the post-World War II United States. Government spending dropped, incredibly rapidly and incredibly dramatically, and that's because there was this political imperative to bring the boys home, right? I mean, that there were actually, Keynesians, who were emerging in importance at that moment, who were kind of emerging in prominence, who said, if we demobilize, those millions of men and bring them home, it will cause a deeper and longer-lasting depression than anything that has ever been seen. And of course, we know that what actually happened was exactly the opposite. A boom unlike anything that had ever been seen. And one thing that happened there, in addition, of course, to dramatically reducing defense spending, was that all of the civilian boards, agencies, regulators, they were taken apart too. The price control mechanisms were disassembled incredibly rapidly, and it's something of a myth that, according to Arnold Kling, who wrote this piece for us, it's something of a myth that what happened is that the wartime industry simply converted to peacetime production. Actually, former wartime industries that were converted to peacetime industries absorbed a relatively small proportion of the soldiers who came home, and most of them went into service jobs and part of the kind of new American economy that characterized the second half of the 20th century. So I think it's important to remember that, given a little bit of freedom, given a little bit of space to move, and given back their own money, Americans did have a much higher savings rate at that point, and kind of nothing to spend it on for a while. So there was this pent-up savings that suddenly burst into the economy, but it was also people just getting their own money back in the form of tax cuts, which is worth keeping in mind.
Sure.
There were similar success stories in the 90s in New Zealand and Canada, both of which were wholly or partly carried out by liberal political parties. So it also doesn't necessarily have to be a conservative thing or a Republican thing or even a single party thing.
Yeah, or looking at, the United States after 1994, I mean, the Republicans initially overreached and made some mistakes. 95 was not a wildly successful year, but then in 96, with the president campaigning for re-election, you were able to get a couple of key pieces of legislation, both of which have been weakened. In fact, one of them to the point of almost as if it never happened. But you were able to get the 1996 welfare reform, obviously, huge piece of legislation and one of the best pieces of legislation of the last couple of decades. And the 1996 Freedom to Farm Act, which was supposed to phase out farm subsidies. Now, of course, in 1998, the first time crop prices fell, they completely reversed themselves. But at least you did have, with divided government, Republicans in Congress, a Democrat in the White House, that was the last time you had really audacious reforms of some of these, previously kind of untouchable programs, and reforms that went in the right direction. And so, we might see something like that. It's going to be really interesting to watch it take place. One area that really needs reform, that the administration has gotten a lot of credit for reforming, but I'm not sure they deserve it, is education. And this is something that we wanted to talk about with the defeat of Fenty in Washington, and some other stories that have popped up about a potential bubble in higher education. Do you think that this administration deserves the credit for being academic reformers that they seem to have gotten with the the race to the top stuff and all that?
Yeah, I am tempted to give credit almost as a kind of self-esteem building preemptive exercise. I don't think the administration has done much that's very impressive, but I almost want to say, good work, Arnie Duncan, whenever he says anything even remotely good.
Right, it's a tactic from the classroom, yeah.
Exactly, because it's so far from what we've seen, at least rhetorically, from past Democratic administrations.
Sure.
And I think that's something worth encouraging.
Right.
Arnie Duncan is the Secretary of Education, and he's a reformer. I mean, he and I might not agree on exactly the right way to go about things, but the fact is that he says stuff like, just a couple of weeks ago, the Los Angeles Times released ratings for all, I think, 6,000 teachers in the city. It was data that the schools have had for years, that the unions had access to, that they were sitting on, they were keeping secret, and it was very nicely done. It was value-add data, so it was just about each specific kid and what the teacher had done for that specific kid from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. It's as fair as you could be, and of course, the teachers' unions in Los Angeles freaked out. It cannot be, they were like, we have to boycott the LA Times, and this is a betrayal. And Arnie Duncan, to his credit, said, what is there to be afraid of? This is data. We should be using it.
Right.
At the same time, applications for Race for the Top money that included transparency stuff got some credit for that, but not a ton. Applications for Race for the Top that didn't have union backing were generally hurt by that. So it's not like something huge and radical is happening here.
Right.
But I think that, and there's also, you just want to read, it's just even after all these years of Obama doing things that I hate, I still always want to think, and this is the magic of Obama, I want to think that he secretly agrees with me about things.
Right.
And, and so I hold on to
He seems so
things
reasonable,
like,
yeah.
He seems so reasonable. And so I hold on to things like the fact that during the election in 2008, he said, we should go with what works on education. And if that means vouchers or charters, so be it. But then the next day, he says, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say that.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, teachers' unions. And then, of course, this summer, he basically apologized to the tune of $11 billion in aid to education jobs to the states. So he's very, very sorry every time he says things like that. But sometimes he says them, and so you wonder.
I kind of analogize it to, the thing is, it's hard to give them too much credit, though, because the empirical evidence on some of this stuff, like merit-based hiring and firing for teachers, and judging them based on their performance and the test scores of their students, and it seems like the empirical evidence has gotten so overwhelming. It's kind of like trade in the 1990s when the Democrats finally kind of became more of a free trade party. They've certainly, they've done a lot of backsliding since then. I mean, that's to say the least. But I mean, it was a Democratic administration that both oversaw, NAFTA and the creation of the World Trade Organization. Both things kind of a long time coming. But you had to have Bill Clinton's support to forge those agreements, and it was just because the empirical evidence was overwhelming. You couldn't find an economist who wouldn't agree with the idea that trade liberalization tends to make both countries that are liberalizing richer. It was just as commonly accepted as anything in economics, and you had even columnists like Michael Kinsley saying this is ridiculous and we have to stop bending to the union's will on this. So it was one of those things where, again, the unions were behind the Democrats' obstinance on the issue, and yet just a mountain of facts kind of eventually moved Democratic elites to support. And with education, you had people like Bob Herbert of the New York Times. You had Stephen Brill in the New Yorker, and the Atlantic publishing stories about these longitudinal studies that Teach for America had done on teacher performance, and it just at a certain point became impossible for the Democrats to protect the teachers' unions anymore from some of this stuff, and so credit where it's due, but credit in the face of a lot of evidence that what the unions were advocating for was more special pleading than in the best interest of the students.
I think that's right. I'm not sure that we are to the same tipping point we were at in the 90s on trade with education
right.
yet. I know when I get in debates about this, which I kind of do all the time because I just think this is an incredibly important issue, but people still aren't, there's still a two sets of facts problem.
Yeah.
There's still a, do charters work or do they not work? Does merit pay work or does it not work? Partially for that reason, partially because teachers' unions, I think, have been better than other kinds of unions at kind of a little bit of judo on some of these facts. They say, oh, well, if teacher quality really matters, schools should spend more to send teachers to teacher training programs in Honolulu, right? This is, they're no dummies, those teachers unions.
Wonder what the studies on journalist quality say. I think there needs to be some training programs in Honolulu for us.
I've definitely heard about that, the importance of journalists, master journalists, isn't that they call them master teachers? I think we need some extra training to become master journalists.
Absolutely.
So I think just so that we can kind of wrap things up here, Stephen and I should note that we are both beneficiaries of the now vilified Koch Foundation.
That's true.
Both of us have been have gotten kind of summer fellowship, internship gigs that were paid for by Koch. Reason Magazine gets some Koch money. And so I guess we just want to put ourselves out there as potentially non-evil human beings who are part of the Kochtapus, as it's known.
That's true. I've been a sleeper agent for all these years, just basically waiting for the right moment to strike. It's going to be the Koch army will rise suddenly.
Right.
It'll be even more, scary and ferocious than the Tea Party because, look, liberals need a corporate boogeyman always. It can never be that, people are, in a genuine grassroots movement, rising up because they're angry about what's going on. Even we were talking, earlier about keep your government hands off my Medicare. Even people for whom, they don't share necessarily, conservatives and libertarians' visions on entitlement reform, private accounts, Medicare vouchers, all that. But I think they do understand that these programs are going broke. And that rather than trying to make Medicare solvent, for instance, the government, the Affordable Care Act takes $500 billion out of it to fund a new entitlement, that they're not going to see any benefit from, and that really is probably just going to be eaten up by higher healthcare costs. People, even if they don't, like I said, share the libertarian view of how to reform these programs, they understand that they're going broke, and so they really are motivated by small government ideas. And the fact that the Kochs, fund a few of these, kind of simpatico think tanks, it's just they can't accept it. Conservatives have to be either masterminds or dupes, and that was, I think,
sometimes both at the same time.
Right. It just consistency is can be thrown out the window for convenience sake. But this is why I think George Lakoff, the guy who wrote all about framing issues and stuff, was so influential, because in his view, liberals were losing not because their ideas were worse, but because conservatives had these shadowy money men and were just better at kind of manipulating people and framing the issues to their advantage. And I think that's nonsense. It would be impossible. Look, if the Tea Party could be controlled, I don't think that Christine O'Donnell would have won that Senate race. If they were really the puppets of these masterminds, because obviously the vast right-wing conspiracy would rather have a Republican in the Senate, and it looks like that's probably not going to happen now because for election. But these are people who really looked at Mike Castle and said he's not conservative enough. I can't vote for him. So. And the other thing is, like, the Kochs are true believers. All this attempt to pen their activism on their own financial best interest is, I think that, you probably know this as well as I do. I wanted to read about, the man for whom my fellowship was named, and so looking into them, they are like true believer libertarians, and it has a lot less to do with their financial interest than I think the New York Times and others would like to make it out.
I think that's right, and I actually think in general this is just something that I find is a weirdly difficult case to make. Is just the idea of all this stuff that we've just talked about today, shrinking government, education reform. There are people who hold the set of views that I hold, and that by and large Charles Koch and his brother hold, who really think that would be the best thing to happen in the country. Who really think that it would benefit poor people and rich people, who really think that it would benefit black people and white people to have smaller government and more individual rights and more privacy and legalized drugs and smaller school bureaucracy. And I think sometimes it's hard when you read a piece like this, the New Yorker piece on the Kochs, to believe how very, very widespread the view is that somehow it's all really about selfish interests. We have a joke here at Reason, which is, if every time we were accused of being corporate shills, we actually got paid by the corporations in question, we would all be so rich.
I know. We'd all be in Honolulu
awesome.
at those, journalist
At
training
the journalist
sessions.
seminars, but in fact, we are just as poorly paid as our liberal counterparts, and we do the job because we love it and because we believe in what we write about.
Yeah.
So, I wish that that's something that people were in a place to hear, but unfortunately, I think as the election season grows nearer, or in fact is upon us, that never seems to be the most productive time for kind of attributions of good faith and bipartisan dialogue. So maybe we'll wait until December. What do you think about that?
I think that sounds like a plan.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you, Stephen.
Absolutely. You too, Catherine. Take care, and I will. I'll look forward to what would you cut with my 3D glasses.
Check it out in scary 3D.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.